Good morning and welcome to Inquirer Live. I'm Trudy Rubin, Worldview columnist for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and I'm delighted to be joined by Chris Miller, author of a new book that is getting rave reviews, including in the New York Times, Chip War, The Fight for the World's Most Critical Technology. This book couldn't be more timely. While many of us have been focused on Russia's brutal war with Ukraine, another critical battle has been going on between China and the United States that few Americans are really aware of. The battle for supremacy in advanced microchips or semiconductors that power virtually everything in our economy and military. From microwaves to missiles and drones, from cell phones to the stock market to factory robots. The U.S. still has the edge, but barely. The war is heating up as we speak. This month, the Biden administration is putting forth new restrictions to try to block China's access to chip technology. Meantime, at a party congress this week, Xi Jinping has been intensifying China's threats to Taiwan. And Taiwan, here's a fact you may not know, makes an astonishing percentage of the world's most advanced chips. Meantime, the U.S. Navy is warning that China could invade Taiwan by next year. So we're very lucky to have Chris Miller to lay out the battle status and the future challenges. Chris teaches international history at Tufts University's Fletcher School. He's Eurasia Director at Philadelphia's Foreign Policy Research Institute, and he's a visiting fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and a director at Greenmantle, a New York and London-based geopolitical and macroeconomics consultancy. To top that off, he's also an expert on the Russian economy and wrote a terrific book called Putinomics a few years ago that helps explain why Putin is surviving sanctions so far. Before we get started, a little housekeeping so you know how to participate.
Yeah, it's all about timing.
At any time, you can submit questions for Chris Miller at the bottom of this page in the comments section. If you're watching on social media, you can go to inquirer.com/live to submit questions. That's inquirer.com/live. With that, let's get started. So, Chris, could you explain to an audience that may not be tech savvy, what do you mean by microchips are the new oil, the scarce resource on which the world depends? Talk a little bit about the centrality of chips to our life today and to our military.
Well, the typical person doesn't think very much about semiconductors, but the reality is we rely on them in almost all aspects of our daily life. You wake up in the morning and make yourself a coffee. Your coffee maker probably has a semiconductor inside. You open your dishwasher has semiconductors inside. You sit in your car has dozens, in cases hundreds of semiconductors inside, and you haven't even opened your computer or looked at your smartphone, each of which rely on some of the most advanced chips produced today. When you log on to the internet or look at your email, you rely on servers that are made with lots of semiconductors inside. The entire cloud where we store our data is nothing but a bunch of semiconductors. So the typical person will touch many dozens, in some cases hundreds of semiconductors every single day of their lives, even though most of us have hardly ever seen a semiconductor. You only come across one if you happen to break your phone so badly that you can see the inside of it. But as a result, we don't understand in a granular way the extent to which we can't live without them. But when you think about the extent to which all sorts of devices rely on computing power today, are becoming smarter on a regular basis, all of that intelligence is provided by computer chips, processor chips, memory chips, chips that process signals and turn them into data. And as a result of that, our society simply can't function without access to chips.
And just to clarify for people, when you say chips and semiconductors, you're basically referring to the same thing.
That's right. In a pure scientific or engineering sense, a semiconductor is a class of materials such as silicon, which is the material out of which most chips are built. But in layman's terms, we use semiconductor or chip or integrated circuit as equivalent terms.
And just to give people an even larger idea of the importance of chips, today's military is based on chips as well, isn't it? As you can see already in the Ukraine war.
Well, that's right. And military systems are actually where chips first emerged from. During the early Cold War, one of the key military challenges was guiding missiles accurately. And if you think back to the early part of the 20th century, weapons weren't guided at all. They were aimed and then shot. Whereas now we take for granted that missiles can be fired and fly for hundreds of miles and then hit a target pretty accurately at the end. And that's only possible because they've got semiconductors inside. And so the first chips emerged because guidance computers on missiles needed to become smaller and smaller. And chips were invented to provide this miniaturized computing power that missiles needed. Now, today, it's not just missiles that have chips inside of them. Almost every military system relies on chips to process software, to sense data, to communicate with other types of defense systems. And so the military is one of the most reliant parts of our economy and society on semiconductors. They use both ultra advanced semiconductors for the most complex types of data processing, but also lots and lots of more basic semiconductors, because all types of machinery today relies on chips to manage their data.
So explain this. The U.S. had the lead in chips. It was our scientists who first figured out how to design them, how to miniaturize them. And so given that we were out in front, why have we almost lost that lead? Why is the competition breathing down our neck?
Well, when the chip industry was first founded in the late 1950s and grew over the subsequent couple of decades, it was focused almost entirely in the US and California and Texas and a couple other places in the United States. And at the time, companies that made chips like Texas Instruments or Fairchild Semiconductor in California conducted almost all of the process steps themselves. They made their own machinery, they processed their own chemicals, they designed their own chips. They did it all in-house. But over the past couple of decades, as chips have gotten more and more and more complicated, it's been just impossible for a single firm to do everything in-house. And so supply chains have gotten longer as a result of that. Now, some firms make the machinery, different companies make certain types of the chemicals you need, other firms make the silicon wafers, and other firms still design chips. So the supply chain has gotten longer over time as the process of making chips has gotten more complex. And as the supply chain has gotten longer, different countries have specialized in different parts of the supply chain process. So the United States is still a leader in multiple parts of the process, in designing chips, for example, and producing the machine tools that you need to make chips. But when it comes to the actual manufacturing of chips, the US has fallen behind. And today, companies in Taiwan and South Korea make more advanced processor chips than any US company can do.
So why did Taiwan become the 800-pound gorilla? It's the wrong metaphor, but the biggest star and by far the biggest producer of sophisticated chips?
So today, as you mentioned, Trudy, Taiwan's biggest chip firm called TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, is the most advanced chip maker in the world. And it produces 90% of the world's processor chips, the types of chips that you find inside of an iPhone, for example, or inside of your computer. And TSMC was founded over 3 decades ago by a businessman named Morris Chang, who'd served most of his career in Texas, where he was an executive at Texas Instruments, one of the leading U.S. chip makers. But in one of the great business errors of the 20th century, he was passed over for the CEO job, and so left Texas Instruments and was looking for another company to work at, and was approached by the Taiwanese government to set up a semiconductor industry in Taiwan, and they gave him a substantial amount of funds to start a new business. And he founded this business in 1987, began growing it over time, and since then it's become the most successful semiconductor company in the world for a couple of reasons. First off, its technological capacities have outstripped everyone else in the world. It's gotten better and better and better at a rate faster than any other company. Secondly, it's become the biggest producer of processor chips in the world, and it's done this by acquiring lots of different customers and producing chips for lots of different customers, rather than just producing chips that it designed itself in-house. And then thirdly, as the number of companies that could keep up with the immense scale that was necessary to produce advanced chips declined, simply because today companies must be massive to be economically viable at advanced production. Today is only really 3 firms in the world that can produce anything close to advanced chips. So the number of competitors in the race, if you will, declined over the past couple of decades. And the Taiwanese jumped ahead in that race several years ago. And so today they're meaningfully ahead of South Korea's Samsung and America's Intel. And those are really the only 3 companies that are anywhere close to the ability to produce advanced processor chips.
So keep that amazing fact in mind that Taiwan is the world leader in producing sophisticated chips, and we need them, and China needs them, and the rest of the world needs them. I will come back to that and to the threat to Taiwan. But first, let me ask a few other things about Russia and China. Now, one might have expected Russia to be a technological competitor, given that they have an educated population, they have long had an education system that produces theoretical scientists at a high level, and they spend a huge amount on their military. So why has Russia been such a flop at this, as we see in Ukraine? Where the Russians are running out of precision missiles and are just dumping non-precision missiles that date back decades.
Well, that's absolutely right. And if you take apart most advanced Russian missiles and look inside of their guidance computers, what you'll find are guidance computers powered by chips made abroad, American chips, South Korean chips, Taiwanese chips. All of them are necessary for the production of Russian missiles, because Russia can't produce advanced chips, or even chips that are close to advanced, at home. So why not? Why can't Russia do this? There are a couple of reasons. First is that Russian firms have never succeeded in building the type of scale you need to have effective semiconductor businesses. They've never been close to the size of what we have in Taiwan or in South Korea. And so that's been a source of inefficiency in the Russian chip industry. Second, they've never tried to serve global markets in a really serious way. And because of the massive scale you need to have a functional business, a profitable business in the chip industry, you have no choice but to try to sell to the entire world. That's the only market large enough to fund the research and the investments needed in the chip industry. So this combination of limited scale plus a inability to tap into global markets, which then contributed to the scale problem, has kept Russian firms back for a very long time. And so today, Russia has a tiny number of chip makers with really very limited production capacity, and all the production capacity is at really old technological nodes, which is why the Russian military is deeply dependent on its ability to buy or to smuggle nowadays chips in from the US or Taiwan or South Korea.
And that's why U.S. sanctions on Russia, Western sanctions, as a result of the Russian war in Ukraine, will further hamper Russia, correct, from moving forward. And also, would you say Russia is hampered by the fact that they still retain an old Soviet-style system and have cracked down at attempts to break out of that by private business people.
That's certainly right. And in the Russian chip industry, and again, it's a really tiny industry, what you find is that it's been so deeply tied to the Russian military industrial complex, which is its primary customer, that there hasn't been very effective management as a result. There has been some private ownership in certain parts of the Russian chip sector, but the reality is that because the primary customers is the government, the defense sector, management has been low quality, I think is a generous description of it. And so, yes, the sanctions and the export controls that the US, Europe, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, and other countries imposed on Russia in the early part of this year will have a big effect. I think they already are having a major effect. If you look at Russian media reports, Russian media have reported a major jump in the share of defective chips that Russia is able to purchase from third-party dealers. So Russia still can go to chip dealers in countries that aren't imposing sanctions, that are Turkey or Central Asia or China even. Iran, absolutely, and try to purchase chips, and to some extent that works. But Russian media have reported major increases in defect rates in those chips because they're buying them off the gray market or the black market. And if you put yourself in the position of a Russian defense official who's trying to acquire chips from abroad, you never know which of those chips are functional, which ones are not functional, and which ones might even have been manipulated by one of your rivals and surreptitiously sold to you with the aim of sabotaging your defense equipment. So it's a really bad position to be in if you're Russia, but they've got no other option than smuggling in.
So that brings us to China. We know that Xi Jinping has publicly expressed his determination to catch up and outstrip the U.S. In chips and sophisticated chips and chips that are necessary for supremacy and artificial intelligence. And Xi Jinping has even set these deadlines, made in China 2025, when China was supposed to go from importing 86% of its chips to only importing 30%. And this is before we even get to the issue of Taiwan, which exports a huge amount of chips still to China. So just in terms of China's catch-up ambitions, right now they are dependent on foreign technology. Almost all of it is controlled by China's geopolitical rivals and by Taiwan. So where do China's catch-up efforts stand, and how have they gone about trying to catch up?
Well, China has been trying to catch up in different ways now for several decades, but the current iteration of the catch-up process began in 2014 when China started a new government subsidy push designed to push money into the industry, both from the national level government, from provincial governments, from local governments, and also from the private sector, trying to increase the amount of capital available to firms, increase investment, and thereby make technological progress. That's the goal. And the amount of money that's been pushed in is substantial. It's hard to get exact figures because it's happening at so many different levels, but certainly many tens of billions of dollars and probably in the low hundreds of billions of dollars have been spent over the past 8 years since 2014. So the spending has been substantial, but China still remains quite far behind, especially if you're talking about complete self-sufficiency. If you look, for example, at the complex software tools needed to design chips, right now it's 3 US firms that make up the bulk of the market for those software tools. China's got only a very small market share. If you look at the machine tools you need to produce chips, China, again, has a really minuscule market share. And if you're talking about making advanced chips, China has to try to import them from the US, the Netherlands, and Japan, the 3 countries that produce these tools. And when it comes to designing chips, China's also behind in many spheres. Designing the chips used in smartphones, for example, is largely done outside of China. Designing the chips used in PCs is done largely outside of China. Designing chips used for AI and data centers also largely outside of China. So in design as well, China's far behind. And when you put all this together, what you get is a country that is far from self-sufficient in chips, and actually quite the contrary, which is why China spends more money importing chips than it does importing oil. China is highly reliant on chip imports to support its industry. And this is not going to change soon, I don't think. Despite all of the funds going into the industry, the reality is that there's so much ultra-specific, super precise machinery and software involved that it's simply not something you can create overnight, even if you're willing to spend several tens of billions of dollars doing it. So for the Chinese government, this is a real vulnerability, because right now they're just heavily reliant on American, Japanese, Dutch tools and production processes that are the best in the world in Korea and Taiwan, and China lags behind in all of these spheres.
Can China just steal the technology?
Well, not easily. If you look at, for example, the process of making advanced chips, what you find is that all three of the world's leaders, Samsung, Intel, and TSMC in Taiwan, they all use the same machines from the same 5 companies. But because TSMC has unique knowledge, special processes, personnel that have the ability to produce better chips, the results are simply better at TSMC. It's not something that you can just copy and paste. There's sort of a secret sauce inside of the company that makes it work better, and has made it work better for the past half decade or so than its rivals, even though they're all using the same machines and the same software. So there's a lot in this industry that's not copy and pastable. The machine tools as well that we're talking about, these are the most advanced machine tools, most precise machine tools humans have ever made, capable of manipulating materials at almost the atomic level. So the amount of precision involved in this is such that you can't just take a knockoff and hope that it works well. You need a machine that will be able to move tiny bits of materials with almost perfect accuracy and run 24 hours a day. Because if you have a machine that costs $100 million and it's broken on a regular basis or shut down occasionally for repairs, the costs of that become really prohibitive. So you need machines that are perfectly accurate, rarely break down, and have these unique capabilities. And there's only a couple of companies that can provide these machines in the world.
So if that's true, why have there been all these books written, Kai-Fu Lee, speculating that China was going to become the runaway leader in critical areas like artificial intelligence? Why was Huawei, a huge telecoms Chinese company in Shenzhen, on the road to becoming the leader in 5G, the new generation of internet hardware, and brilliant phones, cell phones? So explain. I mean, is China in the running? Were they about to take over until we challenged back? Or are they still capable of taking over the lead?
Well, it depends on which sector you look at. I think if you look, for example, at telecoms equipment like Huawei produces, what you'll find is that in Huawei's telecom equipment, in Nokia's, and in Ericsson's, which are the 3 big producers of the boxes that sit on top of cell phone towers, inside all those are chips made with US technology. So they're the leaders at integrating this technology, but if you take apart their boxes, you find US designed, Taiwanese produced chips inside. So that's a place where Huawei's found itself very reliant on the US. And as the US has tried to restrict the availability of these chips to Huawei, Huawei hasn't had great alternatives. It's been very costly and difficult to find alternatives. If you look at the AI space, what you find,
intelligence.
yeah, artificial intelligence. What you find is that if you assume everyone in the world, China and the rest of the world, will have access to similar computing power, in other words, similar chips, then maybe it's true that China has an advantage, or at least has equivalent capabilities to the United States. And if you ask yourself, what does it take to produce artificial intelligence? You need some data to run through your algorithm. You need a smart algorithm to churn through the data. And then you need a lot of computing power, because it takes a lot of chips to actually do the churning through the data. And that's been the key driver of the expansion of artificial intelligence throughout economy and society over the past decade. It's not that computer scientists have gotten multiple times smarter. It's not that they have more data than before. It's that chips have gotten multiple times better, as they do on a regular basis, thanks to what's called Moore's law. And as chips have gotten better, computing power has become more accessible. It's possible to do harder computations on reasonably priced chips. Until recently, China and the US had access to the same US designed Taiwanese produced chips. That's no longer the case. The Biden administration earlier this month rolled out a new set of controls designed to prevent China from accessing advanced AI chips, and will prevent them from accessing future generations as well. So now there's a gap that's opening up between the amount of computing capacity in China, the amount of computing capacity in the rest of the world. And what that will mean is that China will be unable to access the next generation of chips, and will therefore face a disadvantage in computing power that I think will be unable to be compensated by in terms of having smarter algorithms or more data. If you can't get your chips to the computing for you, it doesn't matter how smart your algorithm is, you're just not going to catch up.
Well, that brings us to Taiwan, and we already have several questions on this. So a lot of the sophisticated chips that China gets are from Taiwan still, right? And the U.S. is trying to pressure Taiwan to sell less chips to China, but this is a delicate question. So before we get to the issue of a possible takeover war by China, let me ask you, can the U.S. really successfully pressure an ally like Taiwan, whose chip makers depend not just on business with the U.S. and the world, but on business with China?
Well, I think if you look at Taiwanese companies, and especially the Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company, the biggest of the Taiwanese firms, what you'll find is that although they sell a fair number of chips to China, their most important customers are US firms. So the biggest customer of TSMC is Apple, which has been the biggest customer now for the better part of a decade. Its other biggest customers are companies like NVIDIA, companies like AMD, other US firms that design chips and then have TSMC produce those chips. So that's one thing that ties TSMC to the US pretty closely. The second is that inside of TSMC's facilities are American-made machine tools, without which no company in the world can produce chips. So like China, Taiwan is also dependent on the import of machine tools from the United States. And so that's an additional thing that brings the US and Taiwan together. There's mutual reliance there. And then third, there's the security aspect of the relationship that goes beyond semiconductors. It's not only about chips. It's also the case that Taiwan depends on the US ultimately to guarantee its security vis-a-vis China. And so the Taiwanese government, I think, is wary of doing anything that would anger the United States on this issue, particularly because the US is focused on this issue, given its implications for the military balance vis-a-vis China. So all those factors, I think, suggest that, yes, it's true, Taiwan does have a lot of trade with China and sells a lot of chips to China, but the US is more important than China for Taiwan on these issues.
Well, this brings me to some of the questions that are being asked. One listener is asking, should the U.S. go from strategic ambiguity to strategic certainty to deter a Chinese invasion of Taiwan?
Well, I think there's an obvious logic to doing that, which is that you send a clear message to Beijing about whether or not you're willing to defend Taiwan. And I think right now there is some uncertainty in Beijing about whether the U.S. would in fact carry through on its sort of vague promises, and the promises are uncertain, as we said, given the current status quo. I think the challenge with shifting towards strategic certainty right now, getting rid of the ambiguity, is that our ability to follow through on those promises is declining year by year. The military balance is shifting in China's direction, and has every year of the last decade. So I think if we're going to move in that direction, we need to couple it with a commensurate increase in our military power in the region, because the reality is that our ability to follow through on those commitments is declining as China's military power grows. And so what you really don't want, I think, is a situation in which you make greater and clearer promises that you're less and less able to fulfill. And I do worry that if we rhetorically increase our commitment to Taiwan but don't follow through on the defense side, that might be what we risk doing.
Well, a couple of other questions along the same lines. So one listener asked, does the current U.S. government administration really have Taiwan's back, or is it simply using Taiwan to get TSMC chips and counterbalance China's growing power? And, you could roll into that question. You write a lot about the various ways that China could try to take back Taiwan without destroying TSMC, the largest chip manufacturer. So do you think the U.S. has China's back? And how could the U.S. deal with Chinese efforts to intimidate Taiwanese chip makers, short of an amphibious landing, an actual attempt to take over the island?
Well, I think that is really the scenario that I worry we're the least prepared for, is something in between the current status quo and a large-scale amphibious invasion. I think everyone in the world knows what an amphibious attack would look like. It would be unambiguously an attack, but something smaller than that, something that only involved, for example, one of the small islands in between China or Taiwan, further pressure on Taiwan in the cyber domain, for example, pressuring Taiwan economically and politically, all that falls below the threshold of what most people would describe as an attack, and yet could over time slice away Taiwan's autonomy and sovereignty. And so I think that is the key risk. And the challenge is that we don't have great tools to deal with that. We have some tools, but they all involve risks that political leaders might not be willing to take. So I think we do need to worry a lot about these sort of gray zone scenarios in the Taiwan Straits, because they're less clear cut. And therefore, there's more, I think, scope and risk for U.S. leaders and other countries' leaders to misinterpret what's happening, or to opt not to get involved, and thereby begin a process of undermining Taiwan's autonomy. And the chip industry plays a big role in that, because the reality is that Taiwan is very important in terms of the global economy because of its chip industry. And so if there was a sort of smaller type of escalation in the Taiwan Straits, and a U.S. leader or a leader from other countries had to decide whether or not to get involved, and getting involved meant risking some sort of disruption to chip supply, that would involve a massive economic cost to the global economy. And so long as there's an economic downside to helping Taiwan, or there's a risk of an economic downside to helping Taiwan, that disincentivizes leaders from other countries, including the United States, from coming to Taiwan's aid. And so I think that's a worrisome situation, which is why I think actually Taiwan would be better off if it had a more diversified chip production base, some in Taiwan, but also more in the US and Japan and other countries, because it would make it less economically costly and therefore more politically viable for the US and other friendly countries to help Taiwan in one of these scenarios where it's between the status quo of peace and something large scale that was obviously a war.
So just to make this a little clearer, say there was a large-scale war, and the head of the U.S. Navy has just sort of dropped a bombshell prediction that there could be a war with China over Taiwan by 2024. And previous to that, there had been speculation from senior military that there could be a war by 2027. So if there were a real war, whether that involved blockades or, there's different levels of real war short of invasion. But if there was a real war, might TSMC be shut down? I mean, what do you think would happen to it? And what would that do to the world if 37% of critical chips that are produced in the world suddenly stopped being produced?
Well, that's absolutely the nightmare scenario, I think, in terms of the global economic impact. If there were a war in the Taiwan Straits, it's highly unlikely that the facilities would be unscathed. Chip-making facilities have inside of them some of the most precise machinery ever invented. They're filled with explosive chemicals. These are not the types of facilities that are well-placed to survive a war. And so what that means is if there is any fighting, we ought to assume that the facilities get damaged and production comes to a halt. And because Taiwan is such a crucial producer of both the most advanced chips, where, as I mentioned, it produces 90% of the most advanced processor chips, but also of many of the less advanced chips. So it produces around 35% of the world's overall processor chips that are added each year. So it's a huge source of the computing power we rely on. Smartphone production would be devastated if Taiwan stopped producing. I think we might produce at most 10% of the normal volume of smartphones in the subsequent year. Today, Taiwan produces around a third of processors inside of PCs. That would go to a much lower level. Many of the key chips that run artificial intelligence applications and data centers are produced in Taiwan. Many of the key chips on cell phone towers are produced in Taiwan. And then say nothing of the many chips that go into cars or dishwashers or microwaves, which are less advanced technologically, but a big chunk of those as well are part of the 33% of processor chips that are produced in Taiwan. So the impact would be dramatic, far larger than the semiconductor shortage of the past 2 years, because they would impact both the most advanced chips, smartphones, PCs, data centers, as well as the less advanced chips of the type that you find in microwaves or in cars. Across all these different sectors, you'd have large-scale disruptions, and it wouldn't be something you'd fix in a year's time, because we need to increase our production capacity everywhere else to fill up a third of the gap, which is currently in Taiwan. That would be a massive, long-term, time-consuming process to replace.
I think there's more to be said about the Taiwan issue, but increasing production elsewhere. We have a question here on how and should the federal government support our capacity to improve and produce chips. Well, one of the Biden administration's achievements is to get bipartisan passage of the CHIP Act, which puts forward a pot of money to try to do just that, increase production here. Is that a wise way to go? And do you think there's a coherent policy plan structure to increase chip production in the United States?
So I think we need to be strategic about what we're trying to accomplish when we're spending government funds on the chip industry. And there's a lot, I think, that the chip industry is perfectly capable of managing on its own. It's capable of managing its own supply chains in times of peace. It's capable of meeting most market needs. I think there are really just two places where the government has a reason to play a role. The first of those is in basic research and development. And government regularly funds R&D and science, which is something that's pre-competitive. So it's not trying to produce products. It's doing the basic research on which all other products rely. And that's something the government's done for a long time. Government should keep doing. But that doesn't really resolve the question of where are chips made. That's just a question of how do you drive advances in chips. And so that gets to the second thing I think government ought to be focusing on. And that's what are the geopolitical risks involved in the current shape of the industry? Because the reality is that companies can't be counted on to think seriously about geopolitical risks. It's just not what they do. But we as citizens can. And when we look at the world and we find that 90% of our advanced chips come from Taiwan, I think that's reason to be nervous. And so the government, I think, does have a role to play in diversifying our chip supply away from one particular island offshore of China. And that's what I think most of the CHIPS Act money will go towards, and that's what I think it should go towards, is finding ways to have more advanced chip production in the U.S. And one of the things that I think is fits into this argument is that if you look at why is it that advanced chip making has increasingly taken place offshore. It's partly because of the success of the companies I mentioned earlier, like TSMC and to a lesser extent, Samsung. But it's also because it's cheaper to build advanced chip making facilities in other countries, not because labor costs are different. In fact, labor costs are a really small part of the operations of a chip fab because it's mostly machines, not people inside of them. The key cost differentiating factors are tax policy and incentives, because it's immensely capital intensive to build a new facility. It can cost $20 billion to build a new chip making facility. And so tax policy plays an enormous role. And today it's simply cheaper to build a facility in Taiwan or Korea or especially China than it is in the US. And so there's a role for the government in equalizing the cost of a chip making facility so that companies have an incentive to build here rather than build in Korea or Taiwan or elsewhere in East Asia.
In your book, you talk about the clever strategy of TSMC in Taiwan, because they're not involved in geopolitics, or they haven't been up until now. Their whole mantra was they would build chips for anyone, give them the designs, and they would build the sophisticated chips. So it was a very broad global market. If the U.S. tried to stimulate chip production in the United States, would they have as broad a market? And could they find the investors? Because the money in the CHIP Act, it's not clear to me whether that's sufficient to convince existing companies or new companies to try to cough up $20 billion to set up a new fab production operation.
Yeah, I think that is exactly the challenge. It's that we're not going to find new entrants into the semiconductor business that will try to create advanced production facilities. We're going to rely on the same three firms that already do produce advanced chips: TSMC, Samsung, and Intel. And so the hope for the US government is to incentivize each of these companies to build a new facility or two in the United States. And I think that's what's going to happen. We're going to have a new TSMC facility, a new Samsung facility, and one or two new Intel facilities as well. And that will have an impact, but it'll be a marginal impact because most of TSMC's investment will still take place in Taiwan. And the challenge is that there's not a lot you can do about breaking the control of these three companies on the leading edge, because there's no way you can start up a sort of a startup business to break into the market. It's just too capital intensive. There's too much ultra specialized expertise in the industry that a startup just can't do. So we've got these three players we have to work with, and the question is, how can we get all three of them to build more capacity in the US and get them to compete against each other, so we still have a functioning market in which competition imposes some discipline and challenges each of them to produce the best chips at the lowest cost.
So far, the facility that TSMC, the Taiwanese producer, is setting up in the U.S., from what you write, it's not going to be the highest end sophisticated chip production. It's sort of soothing American fears, but not really changing the dynamics of Taiwan still being the biggest producer. Is that correct? And can that?
Yeah, I think that is correct. It's going to be close to the cutting edge, but not the most cutting edge when it comes online. And it's going to be relatively small in capacity. So the number of chips that will be produced is not huge. So I think you're right to say that it's not going to be a game changer. Could that change? Well, it depends on what TSMC, the Taiwanese company involved, can either be incentivized to do via more spending or coerced to do by putting pressure on it. Right now, the U.S. government is focused just on the CHIPS Act funding, which will get TSMC to do this one facility in addition to the other companies that I mentioned. But that's just, I think, the first step of what's got to be a multi-step process. And we've got to ask ourselves, what's the balance of incentive spending versus pressure we want to apply to get the diversification of advanced chip production that we want to see.
And is Intel capable? You indicate in your book that there's some skepticism, a lot of skepticism about whether Intel, as the big American producer that we're counting on to increase chip production here, is really capable of doing it. I mean, they've slipped and stumbled along the way.
That's right. Intel used to be the world's biggest chip maker as well as the world's most advanced chip maker. But around 5 or so years ago, the company began falling behind in terms of their production technology. And even before that, the company missed a couple of major waves of innovation in the chip industry. They failed, for example, to understand smartphones would really transform the chip industry, and they were late to the shift towards artificial intelligence. And so the company's in catch-up mode. There's no doubt about that. Can it catch up? I think it's certainly possible. Would I bet on it catching up? I think right now, TSMC holds many of the key cards. We'll have to wait and see over the next couple of years, but I don't think the US wants to be in a position of betting primarily on Intel. We ought to try to find a situation where we can bet on all three of those companies, each of them having more capacity in the US and having them compete with diversified production footprints globally rather than each of them primarily being focused on producing in one country.
So to sum up so far, we have a situation where TSMC, the Taiwanese company, is critical to world production. Just about everything would change, including military capacity, if suddenly they were knocked out of operation by a war or by other means of Chinese pressure. So question mark over the biggest producer. We don't know if the US or Intel, our big player, is capable of really upping their game. We have Samsung in North Korea, but they're also very dependent on Taiwan as well for production. So that brings us back to China. Xi Jinping is trying to catch up with the United States. The Chinese are willing to pour any amount of money into this, and they're also pouring huge amounts of money into modernizing their military, including satellite warfare, also dependent on chips. So is China capable of advancing even under US pressure? That's number one question. And two, can the US really starve China's ambition to be a chip champion? Is that going to lead us to a war? Chris, your sound is off.
I'm sorry. I think first off, we should be realistic about the challenges that China faces. They face immense challenges in terms of catching up because they're right now restricted due to the Biden administration's most recent export controls from earlier this month from accessing the most advanced software, the most advanced machine tools, from turning to Taiwan for production of many of their most advanced chips. And all of this will be very, very difficult for the Chinese to find ways around. There simply aren't easy workarounds. I think it will take, at best, close to a decade for China to indigenize some of these technologies, and China may never succeed. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that if China wants to do this, it will be brutally expensive, costing more than they've invested thus far. Thus far, they've invested a lot of money, as I mentioned, certainly many tens of billions of dollars, and the effect has been limited in many ways. There have been a couple of success stories, but also a lot of failures, and China's catch-up has still leaves it quite dependent on foreign and especially U.S. technology. So I think we should be skeptical of people who say that China is poised to catch up any moment in terms of chip technology. If you dig into the industry, that's just not the case. They're still deeply reliant on foreign technology. But that creates opportunities and risks for the United States. The opportunity is that if you do what the Biden administration has done and cut off China's access to the most advanced technology, you can try to widen the gap between where China is today and where the U.S. will be going forward, and thereby have a growing gap in computing power available to both countries that the US can exploit. The challenge is that the more you do that to China today, if China concludes it can never catch up, that might increase the Chinese government's willingness to take risk today, increase pressure on Taiwan to try to change the dynamic and get access to some of the capabilities that it can't do at home abroad. And so there's some risk that the steps that we're taking actually increase China's risk tolerance by cutting them off from the future hope of acquiring this technology domestically.
Do you think that our pressure to cut China off will provoke them to make a stab at taking over Taiwan and sooner?
I think the answer is probably not, but there's uncertainty around that judgment. I think it's the case that China's leaders mostly understand how complex the chip industry's supply chains are, and the fact that if they tried to take Taiwan, they would not succeed in capturing the chip industry. They would succeed in knocking out the chip industry, causing immense disruption both for them and for the rest of the world. I'm not sure about that, though. No one knows what information is in the briefings that Xi Jinping receives. And it's possible to find Chinese analysts, including those who work for the government, speculating publicly about trying to take Taiwan precisely with the aim of capturing its chip-making facilities. So I think there's some question as to, is China's leadership getting the right information about its own semiconductor vulnerabilities? Is it getting the right information about the impacts of an attack on Taiwan's chip industry? If the answer is yes, I feel more comfortable, actually, because they will conclude that they can't actually succeed in taking Taiwan's chip industries. But we've learned this year, in the case of Russia, that dictators don't always get the right information. Often they get the wrong information. And so I think we should, when we're trying to analyze what's the likelihood that Xi Jinping does this or that, we should take into account the fact that he might be getting information that's just wrong and make decisions based on factually incorrect information.
So, I mean, having put together this incredible book, looking at all the angles, do you have a prediction? China obviously isn't going to take this pressure lying down, because Xi Jinping is basing his legacy on Chinese supremacy in technology. If China were not under Xi Jinping seen as aggressive, as militarily expansive, then this would just be an economic competition. But in a sense, we're trying to thwart them economically because we see largely because we see their chip industry as a military threat. This is the stuff that wars grow out of. So, when you're trying for your consultancy to analyze, where things are going to be in 1 or 2 years, because Xi Jinping seems very anxious to move on this Taiwan issue, how do you see things developing?
Well, I think it's true that we've got an economic competition in terms of the chip industry, and both the U.S. government and the Chinese government see it partly in economic terms. But I think you're right to say that both governments also see it in strategic terms. And when the Chinese government looked at the chip industry and the fact that it has to import such tremendous volumes of chips every year, it sees this not only as a costly process, but also as a process that is vulnerable to U.S. cutoffs. And the U.S. has shown how it is willing to cut off China's access to chips on a number of different occasions over the past 5 years. So this is a real vulnerability for China. And from the U.S. perspective, this is not solely about market share or the success of any specific company. It's also about defense technology, because when Pentagon planners think about the types of military systems they want to field in 10 years' time, they're thinking about systems that are ever more reliant on computing power, advanced signals processing, powerful memory chips, and all this is about semiconductors. So there's a really clear strategic race here underway as to who's going to get access to the most computing power and how does this shape the military and political balance. I think my bet would be that that the Chinese don't attack over the coming years, but my confidence in that is declining dramatically. I think if you'd asked me several years ago, I would have said the Chinese are focused on economic growth. All of the evidence suggests that China's leadership realizes that a successful economy is key to its political fate, and that it's shown a willingness to set aside or at least kick down the road these complicated issues like the fate of Taiwan as they focus on growing their economy. Today, that's a much harder argument to sustain because we've seen Xi Jinping repeatedly in different parts of his political agenda downplay economic growth for the pursuit of political goals, the crackdown on China's tech sector, the zero COVID policy. All of this is downplaying the role of economics and setting political and ideological factors higher up. So I think all of that does suggest that the risk of war is higher, and the hope that economic integration between China and Taiwan or China and the rest of the world will deter conflict is something that I place less faith in than I would have a couple of years ago.
Wow. Well, before I let you go, I have one last question. You mentioned Moore's Law, and Professor Moore, a long time ago, or Dr. Moore, famously stated, it was 1965, was it? That the number of transistors on a microchip doubles about every 2 years. Though the cost of computers is halved. That was the latter part of it. Now, the number of transistors keeps increasing, which seems almost to defy laws of physics, science. I mean, how much can you get on a tiny, tiny chip? So if war doesn't, if Chinese war on Taiwan doesn't drastically interrupt our advances globally in computer science and military and economy, what about the sheer facts of computer life? I mean, can Moore's Law go on? Can we keep increasing the number of transistors on a microchip, thereby expanding science in space, artificial intelligence, and the whole change of world economy and military science that is coming with computer advances? Can we keep going on this indefinitely? Or is it like the Tower of Babel that eventually, it all crumbles?
Well, I think we certainly can't keep going indefinitely, because the key to putting more computing power on chips has been to shrink transistors smaller and smaller and smaller. And so today transistors are measured in the billionths of a meter. So they're far beyond microscopic. They're among the smallest devices humans have ever made. Now they're going to get smaller still. We've got a pretty clear pathway between now and the end of the decade to shrink even further. But at some point we will hit limits imposed by the law of physics. And at that point, we'll need new paradigms for how to improve computing power, new paradigms for how to have more memory capability on a single chip. But that time is still some way away. And between now and 2030, I think we should expect ongoing increases in the number of transistors per chip, and as a result, exponential increases in the computing power that chips provide, as Gordon Moore predicted now almost half a century ago.
Wow. Well, to sum up, the United States movement forward to keep its edge, ? China's movement forward trying to seize the edge, ? And it seems the biggest question mark of all is whether, and if so, when China might decide to change the game by trying to take over TMSC on Taiwan. And in the meantime, Moore's Law will continue, and we will become ever more dependent on microchips, semiconductors. Thank you so much, Chris Miller. Thank you to our audience. I hope you will join us next month, and you will be getting notified as to who my guest will be. And it's been a great pleasure having you here.